giving you the insider takes and the big picture view on the Dogs. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles with DawgNation insider Mike Griffith and Cody Chaffins.
Welcome into On the Beat on a Tuesday night. A little bit different, Mike, because we have the national championship on Monday. Is this the first time ever we've done a Tuesday night on the Beat?
It is. It's the first time since the induction of the 12-team playoff. This is a record Tuesday night performance.
Of course, we're on Tuesday because of the national championship on Monday. Ohio State taking down Notre Dame. We'll talk a little bit about that game, but really, today, this Tuesday, is the first day of the 2025 season. 2024 now in the past, although it is confusing because Ohio State holds up a 2025 national champions banner yesterday, and it's like when we got Georgia and we're like, was that the 22 national champion? But it is the 2025 season now. We're looking ahead, moving forward, and we're going to talk about the Dogs off the top because as you kind of look at the odds, the folks out there in Vegas are saying, hey, if you're going to put money down, they think Georgia is going to be one of the top teams again in 2025.
Yeah, they were third in the odds behind Texas and Ohio State, and I saw a 10.5 over under it. Boy, that seems ambitious when you consider they were only 10-2 this year in the regular season. But I think it says a lot about the program that Kirby Smart's built, that these expectations are there, that somehow, some way, Georgia's just going to be there. And to some extent, that's what happened this year. They had a really tough schedule. They fell out of the top 12 projections at one point. It was like, oh, my gosh, Georgia could miss the playoff. And then they blasted Tennessee. They survived Georgia Tech. They came from behind and beat Texas. And so there they were, the number 2 seed in the playoff. They earned a bye, and that just did so much good that it didn't really do any good. As it turned out, the 2 teams that played for the title didn't have byes and weren't conference champions. But it's a playoff sport now, and let's get used to it.
I did see an article out there today, and maybe it was just a clickbait article, and it got me because it said Georgia's in rebuilding mode in 2025. But to me, if you're rebuilding, you're not one of the top 3, considered one of the top 3 odds to win the national championship in that season.
Yeah, I think it's more like reloading. When I think about rebuilding, I think about a program culture. I think about adding facilities that are needed, replacing, roster overhaul. Now, granted, Georgia only brings back 9 position players, but with the portal, that's a little misleading because you're bringing in guys with experience that can plug in right away. 2 of those receivers coming in, we expect to play right away. That's 11. Probably one of those safeties, that's 12. So, and then you look at the schedule. It's a nice, cozy start to next season with Marshall and Austin Peay at home. Georgia fans can exhale. They don't have Clemson. They don't have an ACC champion coming out of the gate or an Oregon like they have in past years. So hopefully that'll give the Dogs a little momentum going into next year because same SEC opponents, Cody. The only difference is the schedule flips. And maybe that schedule flip is why the odds makers are saying the Dogs over under is 10.5 wins.
Yeah, 10.5 wins seems like a lot because the schedule is very similar to last year, although you get those big games at home. But, Alabama's still going to be Alabama. Texas is looking like, talk about reloading. No, they're just going to cruise on with Arch Manning taking over. Ole Miss is going to reload. We expect them to pull some guys out of what Lane Kiffin loves to call free agency. So it's still going to be a really tough schedule. I don't think it's a given that, 10.5 is probably right where that number is because you'll get some folks. Do you think they can win 11 games next year?
Well, sure they can. I mean, we've seen Georgia do it before. I mean, I was going back and looking and, even the 2019 team that was really criticized throughout the year. Remember, Jake Fromm had all those different receivers going in and out, and George Pickens was learning the plays, and Lawrence Cager was injured and came back to life for Florida. That team finished number 4. So I do think so, but it's a matter of getting the right pieces in place. I think Georgia's got more work to do in the portal this spring, Cody. As far as the Gunnar Stockton question, I don't know. Is he going to be the starter? Are they going to go out and get another guy? I can't imagine anyone at this stage of the game. But, I don't underestimate Kirby Smart, and I don't underestimate the Georgia boosters that looked at that Ohio State roster in the championship game and said, boy, we better spend some money if we're going to keep up with the Buckeyes.
Right. And this is one of those years you talk about the odds. Ohio State coming in was one of those favorites to win it all. And of course, it played out that way eventually, with all of that talent kind of rising to the top in the end. Now, as we kind of look ahead to 2025, one of the things I wanted to do was kind of look back at our 2024 season predictions. Before the year, on our YouTube channel, DawgNation YouTube channel, we had about 15 videos where we talked about what's going to be the most important this or that for this upcoming season. Now, I want to kind of look back on it, so see what we can learn as we try and predict what Georgia's going to look like in 2025. And one of the things we'll start with, one of the things we started with in that series was, hey, we said, what's the most important game for Georgia? And everybody liked to say, oh, it's Clemson because, it's the first game. But for the most part, our DawgNation panel all thought the Alabama game was going to be key because Georgia needed to finally slay Alabama and prove that it was a Nick Saban problem, not an Alabama problem. And Georgia ended up losing that game, but won the SEC and got their way in a bye in the playoff with the number 2 seed. So looking back on it, do you think the Alabama game, Mike, was the most important? And if it wasn't, what can we learn when we look ahead to maybe what's the most important game for 25?
Well, I think it was the most important because I think that was the wake-up call. I think that was when Georgia realized, hey, we got a lot of work to do. Carson Beck has to really work with some of these receivers. That particular game, there were some receiver breakdowns, the dropsies started, the missed assignments, but also we saw the resilience and we saw the way Georgia battled back. Now that was a loss, and I know it goes down as an L. I understand that, but the Georgia players had to pull together. Their backs were to the wall. They were getting embarrassed. They weren't just getting beaten. They were getting embarrassed, and they saw how they could pull together and what would happen if everybody stayed resilient and continued to play hard. And it turned out that scoring all those points in the second half and coming back and taking that lead, I think that gave Georgia the confidence it needed down the stretch. When you look at a lot of the other games, I believe Georgia trailed at 6, maybe 7 games.
7 halftime.
7, yeah. And they were able to win many of those games, and I think a lot of that confidence comes out of the Alabama game and that they were able to rally and come from behind by, 28-7 at halftime or something like that in Tuscaloosa?
Right.
Yeah,
I don't know the exact score. Yeah, but at some point it was. I was ready to walk to the car and pack up and go home, and they came roaring back. So it ended up being a really important game for a lot of different reasons. Now, when you look at the national champion and they finish with 2 losses, it's kind of hard for me to look at a game as we look ahead to 25. That one's going to be the most important because what we've learned is you can lose 1, you can lose 2, and still win a national title.
And that loss may be what ultimately fuels you. I mean, who would think that Ohio State would want to send Michigan a thank you card? But and I don't think they will, to be clear. But that Michigan game really set Ohio State off. And also put Ryan Day's back to the wall. I mean, this is a coach that was on the verge of being fired. If the Buckeyes don't go out there, well, first take care of business against Tennessee. But if the Buckeyes don't beat Oregon, I'm not sure that Ryan Day would have kept his job, Cody. I mean, these losses to Michigan are adding up, and it's a frustrated Ohio State fan base. I think the Buckeyes needed to win the championship to really feel good about the season. And even still, there's going to be a little angst over that losing streak to Michigan as next year they go to Ann Arbor.
Right. What a swing it was for Ryan Day. And you could see the relief as he lifted that trophy last night. All right, as we look back also on those 2024 predictions, we said the most important transfer will be. Now, you talked a lot in that series about your expectations for Trevor Etienne, but officially on the record for that one, your prediction was the most impactful transfer or most important would be Ben Yurosek. That didn't really seem to be the case. And as we look back at that, he had 16 catches at Stanford. We said, oh, he'll do better than that. He only had 15 catches this year for Georgia. And when you look ahead to how we look at the transfers Georgia brings in, how does this change maybe your perspective when you look back and say, we thought that guy was going to be something special?
Well, it was the most important transfer, and he didn't get the job done, and that's why Georgia didn't have enough weapons, as it turned out, to come from behind against Notre Dame. I knew Trevor Etienne would be an impactful player, and he certainly was. I don't think Georgia would have beat Texas without him if you go back and look at his performances. But Georgia needed that receiving threat coming out of the portal. They needed Yurosek to step up and be, I don't want to say Brock Bowers, but make some big-time plays and have an impact, and he didn't. And because of that, the Georgia tight end threat wasn't nearly what we thought it would be this year. Even Oscar Delp, I believe, only had 22 catches. Now, Oscar got hot late, and I expect big things from him next year. But Yurosek was a bust. He missed blocks early. He dropped passes. He didn't have the sort of impact that we expected, certainly not what the ESPN draft rankings suggested when they said he was the number 3 tight end. So he was important, and he fell short, and it hurt Georgia in the receiving game.
Yeah, and I'll even go on to say one of the other more important transfers was Colby Young, and for the same reason, because it did not pan out. Georgia took a big chance on one of these guys. And I wonder, to me, that makes me wonder how Georgia looks at the guys they bring in this year, if that changes the way they kind of recruit a transfer, or if it doesn't, if you just kind of got to get what you get.
Oh, I'm sure Kirby looked very closely at these players and their character, and I'm sure he did with Colby and Ra too. I think sometimes some issues are harder to project and predict than others, but there's no question that the guy's ability to work in the Georgia system, and look, it's a hard place to play. You know, Tyke Smith used to talk about that, how when he first came in from West Virginia, he was always getting called out. He wasn't used to the speed of practice. It took him a minute. And lo and behold, look at how he developed at Georgia and the great things he did this year with the Tampa Bay Bucks. So not all the kids are able to adapt and adjust and be as effective in the first year. And I think that's one of the things Kirby looks at, particularly at receiver, where Georgia asks these guys to be physical and in some cases also play special teams.
All right, as we try and also keep learning from our 2024 predictions, when we asked who the most impactful offensive lineman would be, you hit the nail right on the head in the preseason. You said it's going to be Ernest Green, and it's going to be if Ernest Green can stay healthy. And he didn't stay healthy this year, and the offensive line had one of the worst offensive line years that we've seen in years for this Kirby Smart team.
Yeah, the left tackle position proved the Achilles heel. It got Carson Beck injured at the end of the first half. And then again, it was probably the most pivotal play of the loss to Notre Dame was the strip sack fumble on Gunnar Stockton that set Notre Dame up for their only offensive touchdown drive, with only 13 yards, by the way. Notre Dame didn't drive inside the Georgia 25 on any other possessions, right? So that gave Notre Dame their only touchdown, and it was part of that run that the Irish had in that 54-second run when they scored, 17 points in 54 seconds? 7 of that came off of that turnover because Ernest Green was out. Monroe Freeling was pressed into action, was beaten badly by the Duke transfer that's currently on Notre Dame's team and forced the fumble. So there's no doubt that the left tackle position did prove pivotal.
All right, on the defensive side, the one we talked about, we said who would be the most important player this season. You said Nazir Stackhouse, and you wanted to see him kind of bump up his draft stock because that was the thought, right? Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse are going to come back. They're going to prove themselves. They're going to become first-round defensive linemen and really, be a force on the defensive line for Georgia. Now, I think they didn't hurt their draft stock this year by any means. I think Warren Brinson and Nazir had fine years, but I don't think they're going to be first rounders this year. So what do you make of kind of Georgia's defensive line? And as you look ahead to next year, can we see finally another one of those first round type guys?
Yeah, for Stackhouse and Brinson, it was kind of a bump, right? Neither one of them got invited to the Senior Bowl. That's a reflection on how the NFL feels about them and maybe some of the reviews they received from their coaching staff. Typically, you'll see a lot of Georgia guys down. I believe 6 players will be down there next week in Mobile, and that's a good indicator who's going to get drafted. Now, that said, I expect Stackhouse and Brinson both to go to the NFL Combine. I expect both of them to be drafted. Will they be drafted by the end of the second day, which would mean in the first 3 rounds? That's going to be a tough one, Cody. So I do think it was important. I thought Nazir played well at times, but he wasn't nearly as dominant as Georgia needed him to be. Obviously, you saw that with Riley Leonard's ability to scramble up the middle. You ask a lot of these D tackles. Sometimes they're playing 2-gap where they have to control their man and be able to cover both gaps. I don't think we saw that sort of dominance in the trenches from Georgia at the defensive tackle position. I feel like we're kind of going down the list of reasons why this wasn't a national championship Georgia team. And yet the Dogs still found a way to win the SEC title and be the number 2 seed for the playoff.
Yeah, and looking ahead, it does get me excited because when we answer that question coming up in 2025, I think we'll all say Christian Miller because we expect kind of a similar thing. This guy's coming back. He's coming back for a reason because he wants to be a high draft pick. So you can be very excited about what he brings to the defensive line. Want to see some of those young guys kind of grow up a little bit too as well. And a lot of them got playing time. That was the one thing about this year is, especially on that defensive line, because of all the injuries, a lot of folks played a lot of football.
Yeah, Xavier McLeod's a guy that I was very impressed with by the end of the year. I thought he really stepped up, and I thought that was important because defensive tackle is really where it starts. And when we go back and we look at the dominant Georgia teams of 21 and 22, that was the common theme. And Jalen Carter, we see what he's doing now, dominating in the NFL. Just imagine what it was like for those college kids that had to line up across from the likes of Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt. Those names aren't rolling off the tongue right now. So this was very important recruiting class for Georgia. I think they found some really great young talent on the defensive line. It's just a matter of how quickly those players can develop.
Yeah, and looking ahead to next year on the defensive line as well, we'll see. Yeah, we'll see if those guys like Elijah Griffin can do something. Also, go back and we'll talk more about Ty Ingram Dawkins too later on. When we talk Senior Bowl, he's going to be one of those guys who did earn his way into the Senior Bowl this year, and I thought he really kind of broke out a little bit as well. I thought he had a great year and kind of improved his stock. So looking back, I don't know if he was on necessarily everybody's radar to have a breakout type season, but I thought he did for the most part on that defensive line. When we asked breakout player, it was an interesting thing because everybody kind of hit something different, and that's kind of what we like to have. Your pick was Rod Robinson, and he never got out of the blocks. He never really had a chance because of injury.
Did you ask breakout player? I thought you said breakdown player.
Okay.
No,
breakout players. Yeah, he was a breakdown player, just never quite got started. Others had Christian Miller, Ben Urasic. I think we all thought it was going to be such a big thing for him. And then Anthony Evans, who it never really clicked on offense for him as well. So the breakout players, when you look at this year, how will you kind of change how you look at it? Because, I mean, you can't predict the injury, right? A turf toe that just keeps you out the whole season. But what can we learn about from our 2024 predictions about 2025?
How hard it is to come into the offense and make an impact. I think the answer, if we're going to answer that now, is probably KJ Bolden. I thought KJ played amazing. In fact, he outgraded Malachi Starks in many games. He played bigger than his size. He was clutch. Thought he was a big factor in the Texas games. Really like what's ahead for KJ Bolden. I would say he was probably the breakout player. It's not as easy as just showing up and catching passes or running the football or winning the job. I mean, there's already a lot of talent on that Georgia roster. So to be a new player and come in and break out, that may not have been the way to go. Maybe we should look at guys that have been in the program already that have been marinating. Like if I look to next year, maybe it's Lawson Lucky, right? A guy who's been in the program for a while who does really big things. Or do we say Nate Frazier, or did he already have a breakout? He did lead the team in rushing, but I think there could be bigger things ahead for him. Yet still, or maybe it's Gunnar Stockton. Gunner's only started one game, and what if he starts and he wins 10 or 11 games? I think that would qualify as a breakout. So as we look around the team for potential breakout stars, those would be the guys that jump to the top of the list for 2025.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about the national championship. When you were watching the game though last night, I do want to, since we're talking about Gunnar Stockton, when you saw of course, Riley Leonard in that first drive was a thing of, really impressive. He ended up yakking and never really matched it the rest of the game. But the way he ran the ball, and every third down, it felt like both teams was like, all right, it's third and short. We're doing a quarterback power, and we are getting that first down every time. Did you at all? Because I sat there and I was thinking, oh, that could be Gunnar Stockton next year. Georgia needs to, write some of this stuff down, use that next year.
Well, it depends on how much Gunnar matures as a thrower, because part of the reason those lanes were there for Will Howard is because the Buckeye receivers are so dangerous that a lot of that field was cleared out. I think Riley Leonard is a super talented runner, and at this stage, I think it's hard to ask Gunnar Stockton to be as effective running the ball as Riley Leonard was. Can he throw the ball as well? I think so. Does he have the targets that Riley Leonard had this year? Well, maybe not from a consistency standpoint, but I do think there'll be a higher ceiling for Georgia receivers next year. So, yes, I think Gunnar can help Georgia out. Maybe not as much in running for big gains as avoiding sacks, extending plays, at least getting back to the line of scrimmage and making it 2nd and 10 instead of 2nd and 16.
Yeah, and one of the other things, that was the last game of the year, right? So Riley Leonard could put his body on the line. Gunnar going into Knoxville next year, I'm not sure in the first SEC game, I want him running a ton because that's a long season to get through.
Well, and we saw that with Carson last year. Remember, we really didn't see Kirby give Carson the green light to use his mobility until that Tennessee game. He said, hey, I called him and said, we're going to use you in the run game, and Carson was ready to go. And as it turned out, it made Carson Beck a much more dangerous quarterback. So in hindsight, should Georgia maybe have turned Carson loose a little bit earlier? Now, to your point, you risk injury, but maybe not, because if you're that much more effective, maybe you're not trailing at halftime. Maybe you're winning some of these games big and you can get Carson out of there. So I think that's something to chew on in terms of getting your quarterback to make those plays. I mean, I know it's not the NFL, and they kind of turn those guys loose and let them play through the fourth quarter with big leads. And we're getting to the point now, though, with these contracts and NIL deals where, hey, these guys are getting paid to do a job. And if that means playing them through the fourth quarter, it means playing them through the fourth quarter. It makes the team better. And having a roster that's stockpiled with other talent that can go in there and play. And we've seen Georgia do that before. Obviously, Stetson Bennett came off the bench in 2021 and helped Georgia win a title.
Now, the one advantage of this 12-team playoff was this season went all the way to MLK Day, and now this is the first time ever we're ending the season, and man, we are so close to spring football. We will be making our 2025 predictions. We're going to take all of that in spring football, then over the summer we'll be making those very similar type predictions. And you know what? It's a good time. It seems like it's a good time to be a Georgia Bulldog, because the folks who are putting their money where their mouth is think Georgia is going to be right up there again this year. So it's very exciting to have a team that is so relevant.
Yeah, I think what you just said was interesting. I think this is too late. If I was the god of all football, I would tell all the teams to take the last game of your regular season and play it on August 23rd. And yes, that means Georgia playing Georgia Tech in the Benz on August 23rd. I'd like to see that game at the beginning of the season anyway, quite frankly, because I think end of the year, Tech is playing for their life, because frankly, after that game, they're not relevant anymore. But if you played at the beginning of the year, I don't think that their players can be running on fumes and, be risking life and limb and all no holds bar. And that's what we saw from the Jackets, and credit to them. But I think it's a lot to ask a team to play a rivalry game, the last game of the regular season. I know, talking with Shane Beamer, he feels the same way about the Clemson game, South Carolina Clemson. If I were the czar of football, or even the Georgia athletic director, I'd say, hey, Kirby, how about you take a bye that week and play your rivalry game 1 week earlier? And then
I'm definitely feeling that idea more than I probably ever have, because it keeps it on the schedule, right? For all the folks who really don't want to lose the game, you're still playing Georgia Tech. And I saw this week, they're talking about how do we go about this conference championship different, because, they didn't want their teams to get left out. SMU was biting their fingernails on Selection Sunday because they weren't sure, because they lost the ACC championship game. One of the things I saw floated out there was they want to use their last week of the regular season to do something different. And that kind of opens that door a little bit for folks like Clemson. Georgia Tech wants to be relevant in that kind of conversation, and that would open the door, leaving that last week of the regular season, let the conferences kind of sew up what the conferences are doing so they can send their teams to the playoff in the best way forward. So I think we'll talk over the summer, especially. I'm really interested because you have such great thoughts on the Georgia Tech game. We'll go a deep dive in that at some point on an episode here on The Beat. But for next, we're going to talk about the national championship. I'm going to share some of the boots on the ground stuff that I saw last night. I was down there filming for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, so we'll do that. It's coming up right after this. It's On The Beat, presented by Ingles.
So, you going to play this week?
You gonna play this week?
You going to play this week?
You gonna play this week?
You going to play this week?
You gonna play this week? You gonna play this week?
You going to play this week?
You gonna play this week?
And welcome to the Ingles Game of the Week, as the War Horses square off against the rival.
He's going in.
He's going in. Go, baby!
Ingles, we're with you every step of the way.
Always happy to have Ingles a part of the show. It is going to be time now to do Mike's 30,000-foot view. All right, Mike, I guess we have to talk about the national championship here in your 30,000-foot view. And as we kind of look at that, I've sat there thinking last night. I was in Mercedes-Benz Stadium watching the game. I said, well, how would Georgia have beaten this team? How could Georgia have done this if they would have beaten Notre Dame, beaten Penn State, and gotten themselves against Ohio State in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium?
Well, I think Georgia has more dangerous pass rushers than Notre Dame, and I think they would have been able to get to Will Howard and get him in some down and distance situations. Now, to be sure, the Buckeyes still would have had explosive plays because there's so many great receivers, but I think Kirby Smart does a really good job of changing things up. And of course, Georgia would have to play error-free, just like Notre Dame. There's not much margin for error with the offense that Georgia was playing with by the end of the year. I mean, Gunnar Stockton in the passing game, not the most explosive. They did have a dangerous runner in ETN, a guy that you could get the ball to in a lot of different ways. I thought that was maybe one of the areas in hindsight where Georgia could have done a better job this season was throwing the ball to ETN even more than they did. Would have liked to have seen more of the tight end usage. Didn't see that out of Notre Dame much last night. I think Georgia would have needed a more balanced offense, but more than anything, they would have needed to create some chaos on defense. And I think they would have been able to do that. Now, could they have turned Ohio State over 2 or 3 times? I think that's what would have been needed. I'm not sure. In the special teams area, I think that's another area Georgia could have won. I do realize that Georgia had a breakdown against Notre Dame and gave up that kick six return. That's not typical for Georgia. Georgia typically wins that area of the game. So to beat to beat Ohio State, Georgia would have needed to win the special teams, create some chaos on Will Howard to prevent that Ohio State scoring 4 touchdowns on their first 4 drives,
and without an incompletion.
I think he completed his first 13 passes, which were a record. So that would have been the formula, though, would have been to create some havoc and get Will Howard behind the chains a little bit more, turn him over, and then have some balance on offense. Again, maybe using ETN as a weapon out of the backfield and maybe trying to go to the tight ends a little bit more than the Irish were able to do.
Yeah, I think Georgia probably had a better matchup, personnel-wise with Ohio State maybe than Notre Dame did. But you know what? Georgia had the great equalizer in the Sugar Bowl where you turn the ball over and you didn't give yourself that chance. That advantage you had with your personnel when you turn the ball over a couple times to give up a special teams touchdown, it just goes poof and it goes away. Yeah. When you look at it, Ohio State finishes a 2-loss, but they proved themselves against Tennessee. They proved themselves, got revenge against Oregon, beat Texas, and then Notre Dame. Are they the true national champion? You feel good about that this year?
Well, I mean, they were the best team in the playoffs. And this is the system now, is to basically start a new season in the playoffs. And here's where you start from. And Ohio State, no doubt, was playing better football than anybody in this 12-team playoff. Now, we can argue and discuss, what it takes to make the playoff. Do I think they were one of the 12 best teams in the nation this season? I do. Do I think they were one of the 2 best teams during the regular season? I don't. That used to matter. It doesn't matter as much anymore, and may not matter at all, depending on what you think about the buys. As it turned out, all 4 teams that got buys lost their first game. And as I think about the Final Four, I don't believe there were any conference champions in the Final Four. Notre Dame played Penn State,
Texas. Yeah.
Yeah. So the conference championship games lost a little bit of their value there, I felt like. Not to say that Georgia shouldn't celebrate an SEC championship. They certainly did. It was a great accomplishment. But now that there's a playoff, it gets a little bit more lost in the shuffle as more teams enter into the playoff. And indeed, 2 teams that wouldn't have even qualified for last year's 14 playoff based on the final CFP rankings that had Notre Dame 5 and the Ohio State 6.
Let's talk a little more national championship. We're going to do that by way of boots on the ground. All right, Mike, so I got to be down on the field shooting a little pregame and postgame, and some of the things that I noticed here. First off, we'll start postgame. On the stage, I look up there. There's Caleb Downs. Hey, kid out of Gwinnett County that, Georgia wanted really bad both times, even when he transferred, but a transfer from Alabama. Quinshon Judkins up there. He was up there kissing the trophy. That's a guy that transferred from Ole Miss. Will Howard's up there. He's a guy that transferred. So it's a transferred, heavy team. It's kind of the question I asked you after the Ole Miss game with all of their transfers. It doesn't seem like Georgia just doesn't build on that foundation of guys who started elsewhere.
Well, I don't think Georgia's been as effective at picking the transfers. I mean, we talked about the 2 receivers, Colby Young and Ra Thomas, both of which were, dismissed from the team for off-the-field issues. Hard to project that, but those are probably your 2 most talented receivers that you were down. And we talked about injuries. Rod Robinson was injured, and I don't know that Branson Robinson will ever come to fruition. His upside would be like a Zamir White, I feel like. He was limited by the knee. So you had some tough injuries at the skill positions there at running back and wide receiver. And we talked about the disappointment with the transfer Ben Urasic, a guy that I felt like really needed to make an impact that didn't. So it is fair to say that these teams did a better job through the portal than Georgia did, and that proved to be their winning edge. When you look at the key players in the game, we talked about Will Howard and what he was able to do after coming from Kansas State and completing his first 13 passes. We talked about Caleb Downs and his 5 tackles and really elite coverage. I mean, they called a flag on him, but they actually just announced the wrong number. It really wasn't even on him. And then Quinshon Judkins, a former SEC rushing champion, he goes for 100 yards. He's the game's leading rusher and scores 3 touchdowns. So I can't sit here and say Ohio State wouldn't have won without those 3 guys, but I would say the odds would have been against it.
Yeah, when you look at it, the Ohio State, and there's been so much talk, this is a team that bought a championship because of all the money they spent. Does that taint college football for you? Does that make you think about a national champion different?
Not really, because if Georgia won it, people would have said Georgia bought it when they paid Carson back $4 million. If Miami wins it next year, right? And if we're being completely honest, we think players have probably been getting extra benefits for years and years and years, the best ones at least. I mean, when these kids are trying to decide where they're going to go, there's stories about people flipping a coin. I'm not sure what to say about that, Cody. I wonder if, what else is at stake. I mean, we go back and look at Reggie Bush. I mean, here's a guy whose parents, I believe, had a house bought for him at USC. And do you fault him? Do you feel bad about that? Was that wrong? You hear the stories about Tua at Alabama and his family coming out. Is that wrong? Is that a bad thing? Or is that just a school using its resources to recruit? And now I guess all's above board. Right. What did the Tennessee basketball coach, Rick Barnes, say NIL stood for? Now it's legal. Jimbo Fisher said there was NIL before NIL. A lot of these coaches are coming out and kind of coming clean and being honest about it. And, some admissions of, some, I think, indirect guilt. And even when the FBI did their investigation into basketball, I believe there was a Hall of Fame coach at Kansas that found guilty, and Kansas said, great, let's give him a lifetime contract. So I guess if nothing else, a lot of these, presumptions are kind of out the window now. We're aware that money is a factor. Does this bring more potential donors to the table? Yes. Does it bring more overt, covert corporate sponsorship? Yes. I've been saying from the jump, Georgia's got to get into Atlanta corporate sponsorship, and again for another day. But this is part of the reason why helping Georgia Tech out with this home and home really doesn't work in Georgia's favor, because you're basically splitting your audience and your potential advertisers with another school that you're competing against in Atlanta. So to me, I think this sport's going to get even more bloodthirsty and more cutthroat. That's the name of the game. And if I know the SEC right, they're going to find a way to get back into that championship game. This is 2 years in a row now without an SEC champ, Cody.
Yeah, really interesting to think about. But yeah, for me, all the hand wringing about, they paid. It's been college football for a long time. One of the other things, my boots on the ground spotted Rich Clark, executive director of the college football playoff. Mike, first year of the 12-team playoff. Your just overall reaction. Did this do the sport a service or a disservice having a 12-team playoff?
Well, Rich Clark was a 38-year Air Force veteran and a general. I've got all the respect in the world for him. And listening to his press conference at the start of the year, he said that schedule strength would be one of the main metrics because it was one of the few that was able to transverse across all conferences versus, as Kirby pointed out, a good run defense in one league isn't necessarily equate to a good run defense in another, right? I think that now that we've seen it, this was kind of a test tube season. I think we're going to look now at the automatic buys and who gets them. I think we'll look at the validity of a buy and the value of a buy. I think we may look at the games that were at home stadiums. Is there a better way to promote or to sell some guaranteed tickets in advance? It's a lot to ask a 100,000 seat stadium to sell out in 2 weeks when there's inclement weather. So I do think there would. Yeah, 3 weeks. So I do think there were some things that came up there that we have to look more closely at as we try to refine this, because this is the way it's going to be by and large next season as well. There's not going to be any sweeping changes, if any. 2026, there's a new contract, and that's when we discuss whether or not this thing will stay at 12 or go to 14 or 16, or how the parameters might change.
All right, so there's some more big picture boots on the ground things I saw. This was kind of a very small nugget. One of the things that was interesting, and we talked about Georgia Tech, but Brent Key, Georgia Tech's coach, he was walking around yesterday willing to talk to anybody who wanted to talk to him. He was going to do an interview. He was putting himself out there, and you know what? Good for them. Their program needs it, I guess. But one of the people he was talking to, and this was not just for an interview for getting some FaceTime on ESPN, but I just saw him chatting up Chip Kelly, the offensive coordinator for Ohio State, who obviously had a great game with the Buckeyes winning the championship there. But just interesting to me because I went back and I was like, were they coaching together somewhere? And I couldn't put all the people. But I'm sure at some point Chip was in the NFL recruiting one guy that Brent Key was coaching at offensive line somewhere, maybe at Alabama. But just guys talking ball was always very interesting to me. It really is a close community. All these guys know each other.
I thought maybe he was going over there saying, hey, if you ever play Georgia, here's my number. I gave Al Golden the blueprint to beat Georgia. At least that's what Al Golden said. The Notre Dame offensive coordinator said that the Georgia Tech game against Georgia gave them a blueprint of sorts. And I reported that. A lot of Georgia fans didn't like it. They said, wait a minute, that's not why they lost. Well, maybe not exactly. But the bottom line was they had a similar quarterback, and they were able to see some of the things that Georgia Tech did to run the ball effectively with the QB run. Now, was that the only reason Georgia lost? Of course not. But it was important that the quarterback, Riley Leonard, was able to run the ball and scramble, especially at the end of the game, Cody, when Notre Dame was able to run out the clock and get some valuable first downs after that fake punt, not fake punt, drawing the Dogs offside. So those little things, those winning edges, those relationships, they matter. They're real. And believe me, Kirby's got his own network. All those former Saban assistants and all of Kirby's former assistants, they talk and they share notes. You don't think that Kirby talked to Dan Lanning about some of the common? Of course they did.
So Fran Brown, who played Tech. Yep.
Yeah, great point. So I don't know if he really said, here's my phone number, call me if you play Georgia. But he might have.
Some real clean, old-fashioned hate going on. So it was an interesting note. All right, we'll finish up kind of on a fun note with boots on the ground. It's one of those things, you always see the celebrities on the sideline. So last night was no different. You got guys who are alumni. Like, I saw Joe Montana. That was my first time. That was the coolest thing for me, seeing Joe Montana on the sideline. Travis Scott, I will admit, so I had to have somebody tell me who Travis Scott was. So kind of on this topic, though, is there a celebrity fan out there that you like and think it's cool that they're a fan of whatever team? And is there one? I've got one in mind that's maybe too much. It's overexposed.
Well, I mean, the whole Taylor Swift thing comes up first, right?
Yeah,
and she's attached to the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm not sure what I think about that. I guess probably one of my coolest moments was at a NASCAR race, and I don't know if he was a fan or not, but John Travolta was there to be the starter. And he flew his own airplane in. And from the Daytona Beach press box, you can see the airport and the plane's landing. Yeah. And you saw Travolta flying this giant jumbo jet, start the race. I got to shake his hand in the hallway when he came up to the press box for a few minutes. And then you saw him fly his plane out. So that's probably my coolest fan story. A lot of people would say Matthew McConaughey, and he is a tremendous actor. He's such a talent. But he's almost become cliche now, right?
That's the one I was thinking, yeah.
I thought it was cool when Dolly Parton went to a Tennessee game, although I don't really equate her with necessarily a card-carrying Vol fan. Peyton Manning is probably the guy that's the biggest Vol fan out there. He played there. That's pretty special. I'm hoping maybe Matthew Stafford will come around one day like that, and I bet the Georgia Athletic Department's hoping he'll donate like Peyton did too.
Yeah, and I think Stafford, of course, married a Georgia cheerleader in Kelly, and so they've been back. I think they will be back once his playing career is done. So love that. One of the things I do love is Georgia's connection to so many country music stars. I've interviewed Jason Aldean on the sideline of a Georgia game. Luke Bryan, of course, was at a game this year. And those guys, unlike Matthew McConaughey, and I will say this, I just finished McConaughey's autobiography. I like it. I like him as an actor. He went to the school, which is actually a good, if there's some people that attach themselves to teams they never went to. So I get all of that, but I definitely think he's overexposed at this time. But for a lot of those Georgia celebrities, they're not making it about them when they're on the sideline. McConaughey's pumping everybody up and wanting to get in the box. I guess Quavo has kind of become that for Georgia, I think, but not to that extent.
I'm holding out for Wayne Knight. I'm holding out for Wayne Knight from Seinfeld so they can put on the scoreboard, "Hello, Newman," and the student section
Mike.
can
Get him on the show.
"Hello, Newman." And he's the most famous Georgia alum, right? Wouldn't you say?
There's so many out there. Kim Basinger was a big Georgia fan. Kenny Rogers. There's a great old video that I used to find. Kenny Rogers and Kim Basinger playing tennis with Dan McGill over the Dan McGill
Wow.
Tennis Center. Some really cool stuff. I've run into Samuel L. Jackson on a Georgia sideline before. I thought that was cool. I guess he had a daughter, I think, that was enrolled at some point. So he was in red and black. That was a cool thing. So many cool Georgia fans out there.
How about Herschel Walker? How about we see Herschel on the sideline? You know, I mean, here's a
He'll be in the
Heisman
Bahamas
Trophy.
now, right? He's the ambassador.
He is the ambassador. He's got a
Maybe we'll
Georgia
see him on the
degree.
DwagNation cruise. I think that's what we got to be working on. Can he be in Nassau that day that we park on Utopia of the Seas and the DwagNation
That's
cruise?
some creative thinking right there.
We got to get all of that to come together for us. All right, so that was some good stuff from on Boots on the Ground. It was very different for me shooting a game that was not a Georgia game. It was much more relaxed, but I didn't like it. So anyway, maybe I'll shoot the national championship next year, and we'll shoot it with some red and black going on. All right, take another break here on the beat. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Senior Bowl coming up next week. Mike and Kaylee are headed down there, so we'll talk about the six Georgia Bulldogs who are heading down to Mobile for this year's Senior Bowl. But before we do, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor. Daytona Beach is a part of the program today. Loving having Daytona Beach sponsor everything on DawgNation. Daytona Beach is one of those places special in my heart. Grew up going down to Daytona Beach. My grandmother had a condo down there. So many days we've spent at Aunt Catfish's eating out there. Also, you mentioned Daytona International Speedway. We got the Daytona 500 coming up next month. And the one thing that I learned, you talked about the airport there, Mike. That's an international airport and a really nice airport. I'm so used to driving down to Daytona Beach. I did fly down to cover NASCAR a couple years ago, and I was really impressed by the airport there. So if you're one of those folks who's looking what to do for spring break this year, or you're looking at summer vacations, you of course can always look to Daytona Beach. If you're one of those folks who's fortunate enough, maybe don't have kids, can travel on off season, you can find some great stuff. Go to DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals, and you can find all the deals to get yourself down to the 23 miles of Atlantic beachfront down there at Daytona Beach.
And you can drive on the beach there, Cody. You get to
yeah.
drive on the beach at Daytona. It is an awesome beach. I went to cover 30 races down there. Awesome place to go.
Love Daytona. All right, so you're heading down to Mobile, the Gulf side, next week, as you had all the dogs going down to the Senior Bowl. And read off the list: Dan Jackson, Ty Ingram Dawkins, Smile Munden, Tate Ratledge, Jared Wilson, Trevor Etienne, and Arian Smith. Really good group going down there. As you look ahead to the Senior Bowl and these guys trying to prove themselves for all the NFL scouts and coaches who will be down there, which one of those guys you think has the most work to do or can really, really shine on that kind of stage?
Well, first of all, I'll say this, the Senior Bowl now can take juniors. So if you're wondering why you're seeing so many more Georgia guys all of a sudden, it's a pool of juniors and seniors. So that's one of the things that's changed recently. So there's a lot more talent than there's been. Jalen Milroe will be down there as well. That'll be interesting to take a look and see what Jalen does
around him.
I'm sure there will be. I think Etienne, I think Etienne's a guy. He was banged up a lot this year with the shoulder and the ribs. I think teams are going to want to get their eyeballs on him. How big is he? Is he too small to run between the tackles in the league? I think Trevor's ability to catch the ball is really going to show up, and we're going to get to see his speed. Remember, last year, Ladd McConkey made a lot of money at the Senior Bowl. Nobody could cover him. Jim Harbaugh was obviously watching. Ladd jumped up first or second pick of the second round. I think he signed a rookie record deal for a second round pick. So a lot of work can go down. I think Ty Ingram Dawkins is a guy, like you said. He gets asked to do a lot at Georgia. In these drills, there'll be more one-on-one. I think people will see the physical force that he's really grown into.
Yeah, I think that's different about the Senior Bowl as opposed to like the Combine coming up. They're playing football down there, and it's playing real football. So it is guys that maybe I think of like a Dan Jackson, who we always think is just making great plays. Is he going to measure the best at the Combine? No, but if people see him as a football player, I think that's where he can kind of shine, playing football on the field.
Yeah, and this is a guy that Jim Nagy, the executive director of the Senior Bowl, told me. He said, there weren't the most requests from NFL teams, but I believe in this guy. Now, Jim's a guy that's been a part of 4 Super Bowl winning teams, and Jim's the guy that called the Seattle Seahawks in the 7th round and said, you better get Kenny McIntosh. And Kenny right now, a budding star, and Seattle really started to break out at the end of the year. So this is a big opportunity for Dan to get on the radar, to get drafted. Now, just signed as a free agent. Most of these Senior Bowl guys get drafted. Nagy, the guy who runs it, former NFL scout, he believes in Dan Jackson, and it's going to be up to Dan to go out there and shine.
And then the other thing you talked about, the one-on-one offensive defensive line always draws a lot of attention down there. Be great to watch Jared Wilson and Tate Ratliff kind of get after guys a little bit. That's one of the best parts of the Senior Bowl, I think, is watching those one-on-one offensive defensive line really get after it.
Oh, and it can get hot. I've seen some things happen after the whistle that shouldn't happen after the whistle. And when I say that, I mean these guys are competing. They're basically competing for money. I mean, this is like you said, it's a job interview, and the coaches want to see one, the talent and the size up front, but two, they also want to see the coachability. And for Georgia guys, this is a big advantage because Kirby's offense and defense are very NFL oriented. Georgia guys never have any issues at all picking up on the terminology or the scheme or the drill work they're asked to do. Other kids from other programs struggle a little bit more than the Georgia guys do in those NFL drills.
All right, it's going to have great stuff from the Senior Bowl. Like we said, Kaylee Mansell and Mike Griffith going to be down there for us on DawgNation. We'll talk a lot more NFL draft prospects and Senior Bowl coming up next week. We are back on Monday night, 7 o'clock on the beat. But Mike, 2025 is here. The season is upon us, or not upon us, but it has started. So it's always fun to kind of turn the page.
No doubt about it. I'm looking forward to, the spring drills already, and I want to see what Gunner's able to do with these new receivers that are going to be on campus. I want to see how much Nate Frazier grows. The offensive line, there's going to be some new faces, new places there. Who's going to be at left tackle? Who's going to be at right tackle? Who's going to take over at center? Defensively, we know about Christian Miller. Who else is going to be up front? And then you had Smile Munden move on at linebacker. You wonder how C.J. Allen and Raylan Wilson are going to fit. You wonder about the incoming transfers at safety. Who's going to be next to K.J. Bolden? Dalen Everett on one side. Will Daniel Harris hold the other? I mean, there's so many questions about this Georgia football team. And then the second portal window after spring drills conclude. What is it going to look like for the Georgia Bulldogs? Again, odds makers think it looks good. 10.5 over under, third among the teams for national championship odds. They believe in Kirby Smart.
There'll be plenty to talk about as we get ready for another year of Georgia Bulldog football. That's going to do it for On the Beat. We will see you next week right back here on Monday night.